Hi, I'm Dr. Nicole Lugosi-Schimpf. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and I'm also a member of the Wirth Academic Advisory Board, the WAAB. I'm really excited to present to you today, and I'd also like to thank everyone at the Wirth Institute for organizing these talks. The title of my presentation is Radical Right Framing of Social Policy in Hungary Between Nationalism and Populism. So, for some background context, what I was concerned about was looking at how Hungary was once the star performer of democratic transition within Central Eastern Europe and among the nations that joined the European Union in 2004. Hungary used to be the model of a successful transition. However, from 2010 onward, this started declining. And now Hungary presents the most extreme case of democratic backsliding in the region, seconded closely by Poland. And this is part and parcel of a rise of the populist radical right. And consequences of the populist radical right in power include, of course, compromised tenets of liberal democracy and social equality, a populist polarization of the entire party system. And so this is not to suggest that there are no parties in Hungary that aren't either on the far right and or populist. But what it does mean is that there is no legitimate left, no counter narratives to this populist polarization, to use scholar Inyeti's words. And this results, among other things, in a mainstreaming of the extreme. In other words, rhetoric such as racism and hateful speech, for instance, against Roma and Jewish communities, sexual minorities, and so on, used to be in the domain of the very far right, very marginal parties, but now it's part of everyday rhetoric and discourse, and that's rather worrying. And so when we look to the party research on party politics, a lot of this literature is seeking to explain the rise of populism and especially the populist radical right. In other words, how did these parties get elected? How did they get in power? A lot of the literature is also focused on either defining and or measuring the extent of populism. And while this work is really important, there is less work paying attention to discourse. And I articulate that this matters. We need to look at discourse because it helps us better explain how these parties strategically compete. And then it also gives us conceptual clarity on the populist radical right. So we hear this term populism, it's all over social media, it's all over the news, you hear it out in public without a lot of explanation as to what does that really mean. And when we look at the populist radical right, this is a particular party family that draws on narratives of populism, a we the people, ultranationalism, and I'll speak about these in more detail later, as well as authoritarianism, so a very crackdown on crime type of approach. And this focus on discourse also allows us to investigate causal processes. Plain language allows us to ask and answer why. Why are these parties in power? Why do people keep voting for them? Why are particular narratives appealing? And so the research questions for this work is the central one: how do the radical right, Fidesz and Jobbik parties use populist and nationalist frames to articulate social policy issues? And then secondarily, I wanted to know what rhetorical strategies these parties are using to give traction to certain frames. In other words, what are they saying and how are they telling a story that is appealing in a way to the voters? And of course, what are the possible consequences? What we're always trying to answer in the social sciences, the so what. And I won't go into too much detail about my research strategy and methodology. but I'll walk you through a little bit of it. So the time frame for these results I'll present today are based on 2010 to 2016. So I'm continuing to do newer work that'll look at the last 10 years, but for the purpose of today, I'll focus on this. And this is coming from my doctoral dissertation results, as well as a published work on social policy. And so the texts that I looked at were from both Jobbik and Fidesz parties. And I looked at State of the Nation speeches, electoral party manifestos, as well as high profile speeches, especially commemorative speeches and annual anniversary speeches. And rather than say social policy, which is a very large area of research, I narrowed it down to 3 areas, and they are unemployment, social assistance, and family allowance. So I used a critical frame analysis. Again, I won't go into too many details, but the takeaway point there is that frames and framing are 2 separate things. So framing is that active process, basically of storytelling, right? How are actors positioning or talking about a certain issue? Whereas a frame is kind of like a picture, right? It tells us what an issue is about. And I drew on 4 relevant strands of literature for this. First, of course, the post-communist party literature, looking at competition, literature on the populist radical right, literature on welfare chauvinism, which I found relevant because I was talking about social welfare policies. So we can understand welfare chauvinism simply as a rhetoric whereby some people are seen as deserving of benefits, whereas others are not. So even a party may advocate for unemployment benefits, but only for certain people and only on certain conditions, which can really exacerbate pre-existing social inequality. And a lot of the welfare chauvinism literature in Europe is focused on Western European countries and the Scandinavian, Northern European countries, with less work on Central Eastern Europe and post-communist. So looking at Hungary in this way also allowed me to investigate if there were differences in welfare chauvinism as articulated in Western versus Eastern Europe. And then finally, I looked to some of the legacy literature. And this is relevant because, of course, there are a lot of rhetorical looks back, and especially when we're talking about nationalism in Hungary, there are a lot of looks back, not just to the communist era, the communist legacy, but also the interwar period. So it was important for me to think about how might these particular narratives and stories continue shaping politics today. And clarifying the concept operationalization, a big ization term, plain language. How am I using my concepts? How did I define these terms? So I adopted these from Chiani and Krull that talks about populism first as a type of rhetoric that's focused on the people or the common people, ordinary men and women, and so on, whose interests are said to be represented by the party. So in other words, you have a populist party almost presenting themselves as leaders of a social movement, right? It's that us versus them type of cause. And the political elites, whoever those are, sometimes it could be other parties. In the case of EU politics, it's often directed toward the EU, so Brussels or Berlin are the corrupt elites, in which the people are oppressed, according to this rhetoric. And again, populism is also defined by the leader, and in this case of the radical right, and the relation between the people and the elites, right? So the leader as this mediator and speaking for the people as an underdog. Then when we look at nationalism, which is excluded from that definition of populist radical right. Nationalism is a really important part of it. And we can think about nationalist rhetoric as this construction of the nation. And so this might manifest in terms of who belongs to the nation. It's often defined through ethnic and even racist ideas and categories about and hierarchies of citizenship. So this is a bit different than legal citizenship and legal status. Um, Nationalist rhetoric also focuses on that construction of the other versus other nations, right? And, members or not. And then this can also lead into discussions about sovereignty. And so, the nation as a sovereign nation with, you know, with strict borders that shouldn't be the domain of anything else, right? And in this context, institutions like the European Union. So when we look at, so as I looked at the different texts as these different speeches in the three policy areas, and looking for, okay, what is coming out as nationalist, what's coming out as populist, what are the key framing strategies that I found? So for Fidesz, there was a lot of support, talking about unemployment, a lot of support for the heteronormative family. So we can see even, jobs or not, this type of policy is structured around, it's very gendered and structured around that nuclear heteronormative family in terms of who deserves unemployment benefits or not. There was a lot of focus on benefits for working families, again, within that heteronormative, man, woman, kids construction, very nationalist, very protectionist framing of this. On the side of Jobbik, which have always been understood as more extreme than Fidesz, there was a very authoritarian tone to the framing, needing to tighten up policy, crack down on people just taking advantage of benefits. Again, very nationalist, very protectionist style of rhetoric. And very strong anti-Roma rhetoric was apparent in the Jobbik texts. And to show an example on, Jobbik's approach, a proposal of a social card, to mete out benefits in their view, a fair way. And so, again, these are not my words. This is coming from the Jobbik Party manifesto. They say the social card scheme would bring to an end the epidemic of criminal usury, loan sharking that exists among those on welfare in Hungary. And going on further, at the present time, a segment of the Gypsy community strive for neither integration nor employment nor education, and wish only that society maintain them through the unconditional provision of state benefits. So when we unpack this, the narrative here is that, well, the Roma don't want to fit in. They don't want to work. They're somehow deviant and don't deserve benefits. So this is a striking example of welfare chauvinism, of who deserves benefits or not. And it's coming through in a very nationalist way, that these are somehow the out group of Hungary, right? These aren't real Hungarian citizens. They don't want to integrate. They're different. They're deviant, and they're just leeching off benefits without unpacking or addressing why Romani peoples are experiencing unemployment at high rates. And so when we look at the different texts and we look at these narratives between the two parties, it would seem as though the unemployment policies are blanket. Although they seem to be criminalizing the poor, it's happening in a blanket way, even for Fidesz. But when we start peeling back the numbers, we can see a bit of a different story. And what the numbers show us are first, we'll talk about unemployment. When we talk about the unemployment rate in Hungary, this is also gendered. Um, when we look at the Roma, for instance, Roma men, only 20% are employed. And Roma women, the number is even lower, only 10% are employed. If we look at this compared to the national average, it reveals a very striking, astonishing picture. So the unemployment rate is, in 2015, looking at 2015 data, was 6.8% for the national average. But for the Roma was an astonishing 70%. So the takeaway point there is that when, whether the Roma are directly targeted in rhetoric or not, uh, any type of policy aimed at unemployment, because the Romas, the Romani peoples are so disadvantaged, any discussion of employment benefits is targeting them, whether it's overtly in the case of Jobbik or more covertly in the case of Fidesz. We can see similar type of framing when we look at social assistance. And so for Fidesz, there was a lot of discussion about the corrupt communist past, that social assistance for Hungary was a problem, finances were an issue, and this is a result of the socialist past, and even looking as recently to 2006 to the Socialist Party. So a lot of blaming going around. Covert racist anti-Roma frames. So again, while not targeting the Roma explicitly, certainly, framing of certain lifestyles and tendencies among these groups that would lead them to a position of social disadvantage, which is very problematic, which is lending itself to exclusive nationalism, this idea of there are in and out groups, there are people who do and don't belong. For Jobbik, in this policy area, a lot of anti-establishment framing. So, the establishment here being the European Union, being the Fidesz party themselves, almost a neoliberal type of approach, especially the bootstrap myth, as they call it in sociology, whereby if you need social assistance, it's just because you need to work harder, you're not working hard enough. So in this case, instead of looking at wider social problems and explanations for why people might need assistance, instead it's the blame game, that we're a member of the EU, we're a democracy, we have rights in place. If you're not making enough money, it's your own fault. So that blaming, and also a strong role of the church, so that social assistance shouldn't be so much the purview and responsibility of the government, but rather the domain of charity, and that the Catholic, and other Christian churches should be helping out in these regards. And taking an example from the Fidesz party manifesto on social assistance and equality, they say, there are many who feel that the social situation may waive respect for the law. We would never be accepted. We are convinced that there can be no crime of living due to the financial situation. No one can place himself outside the laws. For us, equality before the law means not tolerating continued who to be the complement, the regular social assistance to crime. And so when we unravel this and think about what is this passage telling us, although, again, the Roma are not directly mentioned, this is very covert, because this feeds into that popular moniker among the populist radical right of gypsy crime. And again, these are terms of Jobbik, not my own categories. And so, when we say that, when Fidesz is saying that people may need help, yet it's not an excuse to become criminal. When we look at who's being criminalized in Hungary, it's by and large the Roma, as well as other ethnic groups, especially after 2015, Syrian and other refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, other sexual minorities, and so on. So this is a very covert shot, again, at certain people considered to be an out group and somehow deviant. So finally, looking at family allowance, for Fidesz, talking about the family was a very strong place to talk about key values of the nation, right? And what the ideal Hungarian family looked like, in terms of that, as well as a need to protect Hungarian and European families. So when we think, when they say Hungarian, when they say European, again, in these ideal types, we're talking about heteronormative Christian, Magyar, or white European families, to the exclusion of others, especially in that post refugee crisis period, and very anti-liberal type of policies. For Jobbik, unsurprisingly, again, very strong anti-Roma frames, with Jobbik's gypsy crime moniker coming into play again. The Roma are framed as criminal, cheating the system. And when we look at some of an example of what Jobbik is saying, talking about restricting benefits for the Roma in their manifesto in 2010, they say, in the interests of restricting the regrettable practice of the bearing of children for the purpose of economic subsistence through the state benefits receivable, child benefit will be reformed nationally so as to only be receivable after the third child in the form of tax relief. And it is vital that all child benefits be conditional on that child's attendance in education. So here, again, maybe not directly targeting or explicating the Roma, although this was in a section talking about the situation of the Roma in Hungary, and again, this criminalization of these peoples without unpacking, well, why are these people at a disadvantage anyway? Certainly, it's not some kind of a deficit of culture, which is how Jobbik presents it. But this isn't discussed. Rather, it's laying blame, saying that, well, these people are only having more kids to get bigger family allowance benefits, and the kids need to be going to school. They're not going to school, again, without addressing why communities face barriers to employment, to schooling, and everything in the first place. They also say that their policy plan is to, and these are direct quotes, again, not my words, cleanse gypsy political life from the confidence tricksters, criminals, and other imposters who make a living off being a gypsy, and that gypsy crime must be eliminated. So this is a very strong nationalist, ultra-nationalist, even racist frame, rooted in authoritarian crackdown and crime type of rhetoric. So a lot to unpack there, but for the economy of time, I'll just sum up some of the main findings and implications of my work. So first of all, I found that nationalism was actually the most prominent feature of populist radical right discourse in Hungary, because all throughout the texts was this story of the nation and who belonged. And even in odd places, you wouldn't think that in, jobless benefits, you'd find a nationalist story. Yet we do. And when we talk about populist radical right, and the word nationalism isn't in there, right? It's understood that these parties draw on nationalist rhetoric, but what I found was it really was the defining feature that, paying attention to the discourse showed how that populist, rhetoric, we the people versus some sort of corrupt elite, that good, bad, moral, immoral binary, when it intersected with nationalism, this exclusive type of nationalism, it becomes this dangerous story of who belongs and who doesn't, and who's a threat and who's not, which can justify some very troubling policies and ideas, as we've seen. Uh, Along with scholars, in line with scholars like Sikra, there's definitely an ethnic face to social welfare policy in Hungary. So, at times, as I said, it was very overt. With Jobbik, it was clear who was being targeted, whereas Fidesz couched it more in terms of, well, we just don't want, crime or, people to be deviant. It was clear who was being targeted, right? So there's definitely an ethnic and even gendered element to how policy, social welfare policy is being packaged and presented. Gender was also a key component of this nationalist framing. So this was interesting because back in the 1990s, a lot of comparative politics and international relations work on nationalism, of course, said the nation state is gendered. You had catchphrases like "bringing gender back in" and these kinds of things. It was understood that the construction of the nation was very much a gender project, and for whatever reason, as soon as we added populism to this, we forgot about gender. And it is very clear from my work that it matters, and it mattered a lot in terms of who's being targeted, who is gaining or not from unemployment, as well as some very traditional hyper conservative values about what the proper family looks like, which has implications for what men and women's roles should be in Hungary as an ideal citizen, according to these parties. I also found that the communist past continued to shape party politics. So I'm not suggesting that, the communist legacy is somehow locked in and, locks this path, this path dependency for parties. However, this past, and often a very cherry picked, glorified version of the past, continues to be a source of rhetoric and traction for these parties to look back and to even dismiss anything, to dismiss advocating for example stronger social welfare benefits. Anything with social is conflated with the corrupt communist past. What's also interesting about this is that look to the communist past is what defines welfare chauvinism in Central Eastern Europe differently from how welfare chauvinism is packaged and presented in Western Europe, as well as Northern Europe. So it's something that we see different happening. When we talk about welfare chauvinism, it doesn't happen the same way over the entire European Union. It looks different with the post-socialist countries. I found a lot of evidence for party convergence. In other words, scholars like Attila Eik have said that Fidesz and Jobbik are actually, in fact, twin parties, that they're two sides of the same coin. And so, again, although Fidesz, had a more blanket, covert approach, when we unpack it, or as demonstrated from the unemployment statistics, we can see that, well, the implication is that certain groups are being targeted. Whereas Jobbik's rhetoric is a bit more extreme. Over the years, a lot of Jobbik's more extreme rhetoric has been toned down. And so we see even more convergence between these two parties. And finally, my analysis showed early warning signs of Hungary's liberal turn. So, back in the early 2010s, a lot of scholarship talked about Hungary's rapid fall from democratic grace as surprising. And it really caught the transitology and party scholars off guard because, while Hungary had been seen as this model, model transition to democracy and this sudden shift, my work tracing back these narratives and looking at this discourse and this framing shows us that actually as early as 2010, and I would guess even earlier, I'd have to look at that, but um, as early as 2010 we were already seeing hints of the very anti-democratic, anti-EU type of rhetoric that's really prominent today. So I would argue that if we paid closer attention to discourse from 2010 even earlier onward, Hungary's rise, or fall from democratic stardom wouldn't have surprised us. We probably would have seen it coming. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation today.